Hello everyone, you've tuned into our Social Causes Fridays discussions. I'm your host, the tour guide, Jenna Kirisoa for August 26th, 2022. At any point in time you're consuming this content, I can only hope you're doing well, and thank you so much for spending your valuable time with us. It's going to be an exciting segment this evening. We are finally back in the book, Forces of Habit, Drugs in the Making of the Modern World by David T. Courtwright. We are currently in chapter 4. I'm super happy to finally get back into this book. So we've broken it down, of course, into 3 segments. Today we'll be talking about the multi-uses for drugs and different types of treatments, the amphetamine democracy, and then the medical dilemma. So this one's going to be very, very interesting, a little bit lengthy, but please definitely follow along. A lot of very, very valuable historical information in this chapter. So very, very profound messages. So starting out on page 68 with a quote directly, it says, "Not until drugs began to be widely used in non-medical contexts did they generate public controversy and a state of intervention. They, drugs, escaped into a larger realm of popular pleasure and mischief, prompting response by national and international authorities." All right, so it's ideal scientific medicine be treated to treat specific diseases, and they should be treated by particular medicine whose use is justified by statistical studies. The only issue is they didn't start doing any of these studies until about the 19th century. So before that, it was kind of like everyone was a guinea pig or experimental. So let's see what happened. Most medical history regarded drugs as a whole to achieve some kind of broadened sense of physiological effects. Page 68. They supposedly help the body regain its natural balance. That was the idea and theory. So drugs were used to treat multiple illnesses. Tobacco acquired a reputation as a great antidote against all venom and pestilential diseases. So there's a quote on 69, according to these people. There's a legend has it. It says, "No London tobacconist, legend has it, ever succumbed to the Great Plague." So don't know if that's true or not, but interesting legend. So there's a Danish physician in the name Simon Pauli, and he's quoted from his book for different reasons why the government stepped in and gained control over certain controlled substances, and they prohibited some of the use. So some of the reasons were harm to others and those who abuse them, misery to the family, danger to the community, drained resources. They were vices which originated with demonic others. So that's one reason why sometimes government stepped in. Wine was known to be the most of ancient medicines, and distilled alcohol, a quote on page 72, reverently regarded as a life-giving miracle capable of dispelling everything from the plague to melancholy. Very, very positive affirmations for distilled beverages. Whiskey was also highly regarded, and there were debates over tobacco and alcohol's therapeutic properties, and these debates were pretty heated in the late 18th century and early 19th century. So on 73, it says, "Brandy is not a drink to be taken immoderately." A 1614 regulation declared, but only for strength and medicinal purposes. So during that time period, it says initially brandy users had to take their doses standing up. They had to go to the place on the premises, like methadone patients do or experience today in modern times. But in 1683, both gin and brandy were both fully legal. Gin was cheap and started as an epidemic in the 18th century in England. 75 says, "Gin binges inspired anxiety among the respectable and a direct cause of crime. They rendered men unstable to work while destroying their sense of fear and shame. And then some of the end results were theft and robbery." So again, more reasons why governments had to step in, do the whole prohibition thing. But concern over national fitness played a role in increased licensing fees for gin and the fall of Epstein. So this chapter is very, very extensive. I always forget to put the disclaimer out there. This book is very, very lengthy. Let me show you a copy of it. The author again, David T. Courtwright. Very, very lengthy well documented, a lot of information in this book. So these are just quick little highlights and overviews. There is so much more information that I didn't even put in here. So I'd encourage you to get a copy of it. But if you want to just get a couple of highlights, stay tuned. All right. So segment 2. This one's very, very interesting. I learned a lot in this one. It's called the Amphetamine Democracy. So again, a quote on page 77. It says, most synthetic and semi-synthetic drugs originated in Germany, the center of pharmaceutical research and development during the late 19th and early centuries. One firm alone, Friedrich Bayer and Company, sold or licensed the manufacture of such sedatives and hypnotics, as well as two of their best-known products, heroin and aspirin. They soon learned, however, that the barbiturates and other new drugs could mean trouble. So, very, very fascinating. So as drugs shifted from medical to recreational use, they engendered controversy and tightened control. So going a little bit more information. Introduction and history of the amphetamines. This is where I learned a lot. So a collection of similar drugs with molecular structures resembling adrenaline, amphetamine stimulates both sympathetic and central nervous systems, creating a heightened sense of awareness, elation, loss of appetite, and increasing dopamine, or the pleasure-seeking or reward hormones. Amphetamine's first initial use was for a decongestant. I did not know that. So on page 78, quote says, like heroin with Bayer originally promoted as a cough suppressant, amphetamines was marked for quick relief from cold symptoms. It was the base ingredient in their over-the-counter benzodrine inhaler, which was introduced in 1932. So it's been around for quite some time now. By 1946, amphetamine had 39 indicators, 2 being low blood pressure and caffeine dependency. College students used it instead of coffee. In 1936, they were used as guinea pigs in experiments, utilizing the drugs and having pretty much all-night parties and then having exam blitzes the next day. So they learned the wonderful benefits of being able to stay awake. Very cute. They call them pep pills, PEP, and they spread it to other college campuses as well as the U.S. military. And they were giving them to the bomber crews and then the jungle fighters in World War II. So I remember growing up in school wondering how these people could be so brave, or I'm sure many of them absolutely were. It is extremely nerve-wracking, and I do appreciate the veterans, but we're also learning about, again, the history of drugs and what they would push on people to put them in these positions and give them this type of courage. So here we are. We're learning the rest of the story that they didn't teach you in school. Terrifying. So when original patent expired for this, more than half of its use became non-medical. So other people were coming at making up their own variations, and the majority of the people who were utilizing them were not using them for medical purposes. 1950s, an amphetamine democracy rapidly spread, which included truckers, veterans, students, prisoners, and even celebrities. There's a notable name, Max Jacobson, or Dr. Feelgood. He injected John Kennedy with dextrodrive before his televised debate with Nixon. So, more things we did not realize about our politicians, or some of them at least. James Ellroy, not sure who he is, but apparently he became an LA crime writer, and he shared an encounter with when he first tried one of these over-the-counter decongestants, and then his experience with addiction. So, took a couple of excerpts from here. On page 79, it starts saying, encased in little plastic tubes. So he starts taking them out, and he was told how to use them. He says the high was so good, it was brain popping and groin grabbing. It was just as good as pharmaceutical upper high. So eventually he became an addict, and Elroy ended up making a deal with God. I told him I wouldn't drink, or pop inhalers. I told him I wouldn't steal. All I wanted was my mind back for keeps. So he quit alcohol and all of the amphetamines and experimented with marijuana maintenance. Then he joined Alcoholics Anonymous. So there's more to his story, very, very detailed. Definitely encourage you, if you have a chance, get a copy of the book to check out his story. And that was one of the many reoccurring themes with users. So, original manufacturers attempted to deter abuse, but the amphetamine democracy had taken root. So, pharmaceutical industries, they had a history of pushing these samples on the doctors, and the doctors treated a host of vague complaints, handing out these powerful substances. On page 80, it says, they were flying the false colors of safety. They act as the sorcerer's apprentices. So, eventual intervention happened in 1971 in the States and European countries, but in Japan, they cracked down much sooner in 1955. And it says on page 81, World War II Japanese soldiers and aviators used methamphetamine to sustain their senryoku, or war strength or war energy. 1946, Japanese physicians began to see the cases of this addiction, methamphetamine and amphetamine addictions. So in 1955, the country launched a comprehensive national campaign. This campaign, one of the first modern multi-front drug wars, succeeded in ending the way of post-war amphetamine abuse. And Sweden experienced similar success. Unfortunately, like people with withdrawals and backsliding, the criminal syndicate did come up with their own network of drug exchanges, but for the most part, it was successful in combating most of the issues. But there's always been the underground syndicate for these things. So, segment 3, the medical dilemma. Physicians produce educational literature with cautionary tales of the patient. So on page 58, it says, he smokes or drinks more than his constitution can bear. He dumps too much sugar in his tea, drinks too much coffee, takes too many pills, or otherwise abuses substances that are valuable when taken in moderation or in the right circumstances. So physicians are trying to bring alertness and do interventions and tell people to follow the recommended dosage. Clearly not happening, but physicians warned frequently. However, historically, few abandoned their distribution of these drugs when they were hearing reports of poisoning and addiction. So this is kind of where the dilemma comes in. So physicians warn frequently, sometimes, unfortunately, a little bit too late and a dollar short. Sometimes it's the case with Japan and Sweden, the state had to intervene. Financial conflict of interest delayed the discouragement from doctors. So this is their practice, people are coming in, families and patients, they expect doctors to alleviate the symptoms and help them treat different things. And if the doctors are not willing to give them essentially what they want, then they lose the patronage. 86, it says, how does one weigh their potential abuse against their humanitarian and financial advantage? Who should do the weighing, and on what basis, and on what information? Very good question. So recently, pharmaceutical drug industry companies, they're now broadcasting their commercials on television, as opposed to exclusively pushing them on doctors who push them on patients, or I shouldn't say push, offer them. A lot of times it's for genuine purposes to help people, and then habit forming develops. So before World War II, though, drug regulation was limited to about 3 categories: the opium, coca, and cannabis derivatives. So new synthetics was not initially anticipated, and they weren't really well prepared for that. They had to combat this somehow. So I'm going to end with a couple of quotes from this gentleman named Nathan Klein, an American researcher. He inquired on page 89, who should make the decisions as to when they should be used and on whom and by whom? The distinction between medical use and recreational use has been present from the beginning of the psychoactive revolution. It has operated in Jewish, Christian, Islamic, and Buddhist and Hindu cultures suspicious of intoxication. Natural or synthetic, drugs have slipped from organized medicine grasp and have provoked cries of concern and appeals for control, eventually from the sorcerer's apprentices themselves, so the doctors. They're ones saying, hey, you know what, we need to have a little bit more control on this. Things are getting out of control. So that's all I have today for our Social Causes Friday discussions. Next week, I'm going to do a little bit of compare and contrast of what's happening back then and what we're seeing today. So I'm looking forward to that discussion. So for now, I've been your host, the tour guide, Jenny Karasoa. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, God's peace.